It is September 1589. King Henry II of France had just been assassinated, in a period of tense religious conflicts. Galileo Galilei and William Shakespeare both turned 25, and William Gilbert, who would later find that the Earth is a magnet, turned 45. Australia had yet to be discovered, well, by Europeans. The Ming dynasty was ruling in China, and Johannes Kepler travelled to the University of Tubingen to study theology, determined to become a devout servant of the Lutheran Church in Württemberg. Tubingen, beautifully located at the Neckar River, was the academic heart of the Lutheran Duchy of Württemberg. It's good to realize that religion and science were not separated as they are now, but rather intertwined. The belief in God was undisputed and the central basis of everything. The only difference in opinion was how to best serve him and his son, which kind of required knowledge and understanding of their will, which in turn requires deep understanding of the scriptures in its original form. The teachers and the preachers of Württemberg were raised here at the University of Tubingen. Kepler received a scholarship. Such students were living in the Tubinger Stift. This is the backside of the building that, though renovated, still exists. This is the intake order to the Stift, and here you see the registration in his own handwriting. In contrast to the others, he doesn't mention his age, which was 17, but his birth date. To my surprise, it still serves as a boarding school. I'm entering it too, but now in September 2025, 436 years later. A gallery on the first floor reminds us of famous former inhabitants. The philosopher Schelling, the poet Hölderlin, the philosopher Hegel, the writer Mörike, and our Johannes Kepler. Again, the regime was tough. Early rise, cold winters, strict discipline, and not the best of foods. I hope it's better now. Speaking of Hölderlin, he studied at the Stift, also via Malblom, almost exactly 200 years after Kepler. And he made no secret of his aversion to the food, the cold, and the discipline. Hölderlin was later diagnosed with madness and 3 years to live, but lived and wrote another 36 years in that tower, now known as Hölderlin's Turm. He also wrote an ode to Kepler, where he explicitly notes, in poetic words, that Newton from Albion was standing on Kepler's shoulders. Amen to that. The Tubinger Stift was a theological seminar, but closely linked to the university for a broader education, including the 7 liberal arts: grammar, rhetoric, logic, music, arithmetic, geometry, and astronomy. Lectures were given in the so-called Alte Aula, still existing, but of course renovated too. This is a magic moment. I'm standing here, and maybe a little more than 400 years ago, Michael Maestlin was standing here, lecturing about astronomy, and with Johannes Kepler sitting there, watching him, listening to him carefully. It's magic. Johannes Kepler received some extra financial support from his birth town Weil, at the request of his grandfather Sebald Kepler, and also from Melchior Guldenman, his grandfather from mother's side. He was blissfully unaware that this would be the only period in his life without financial concerns. In August 1591, At the age of 19, Kepler received his master's degree. He continued studying theology, not so much for a doctorate, but to deepen knowledge. By exception, the Senate of Tubingen University continued their grant because this Kepler had such an excellent and wonderful intelligence that something exceptional can be hoped to come from him. That was spot on. I guess quite a different spot than they had imagined. So, how did Johannes Kepler develop during this time here? Students received a firm grounding in the liberal arts, but the main theme was theology. Not surprising, as the students had to develop into loyal, knowledgeable followers of the strict Lutheran interpretation of the Bible. Kepler remained having doubts there, but, knowing the answers, would mostly keep them for himself. Some professors were extremely hefty in their condemnation of Calvinist, Catholic or any other view than the official one. Others were less polemical. One of the less aggressive was Matthias Havenreffer, with whom Kepler kept exchanging letters. Unfortunately, later, when religious tensions increased, he had to disappoint Kepler with a harsh decision. But that is later. Another interesting person here was Jacob Heerbrand, who made the point that God can be known to exist from the perpetual order in nature, supported by Bible texts like Romans 1 verse 20. Kepler never explicitly referred to Heerbrand, but that thought must have rooted deep into his mind. Maybe through his astronomy professor Michael Maestlin. I think it is fair to say that the lectures of Maestlin planted the astronomy virus in Johannes' developing brain. In his official lectures, Maestlin discussed the Ptolemaic system with the Earth in the center and everything rotating around, and the whole circus of epicycles, off-center positions and that horrible equant. We know that privately he believed the Copernicus sun-centered equant-less model, and he had many discussions about it with his trusted student Johannes Kepler. Maestlin, who was 20 years older, became a caring mentor, and Kepler has always expressed gratitude and respect. The two kept a lifelong correspondence. Maestlin was a talented and famous astronomer at the time. He conducted measurements on the nova of 1572, that happened just before Kepler turned 1 year old, and the comet of 1577, the one that Kepler observed in Leonberg with his mother, and concluded from parallax measurements that both were not in the sub-lunar sphere. Tycho Brahe in Denmark reached the same conclusion. More on that gentleman in a later episode. Superlunar changes are in conflict with the still dogmatically held Aristotelian view that above the moon everything is perfect, perpetual and changeless. To illustrate the role of Maestlin, let's go for another magic moment in the library of Tübingen University. Look at this, a magic moment for me. The very first time I can see, feel and carefully touch the original books of Johannes Kepler. These are arguably the most important ones. He wrote much more. Mysterium Cosmographicum, Astronomia Nova, Harmonices Mundi and Somnium. I'm surprised by the thickness of these books. The printing press had already been invented, but it was still an expensive and time-consuming, laborious process. But Kepler clearly didn't cut back on words. None of these books were written here at the University of Tübingen. But the first book, Mysterium Cosmographicum was very much inspired by his teacher here, Michael Maestlin. Look here, already in the preface he mentions Tübingen and his most illustrious professor, Michael Maestlin, who introduced him to the work of Copernicus. He even added an appendix written by Michael Maestlin. And by the way, I'm telling you this and I'm being overlooked by Mr. Crucius, the grammar professor at the University of Tubingen, who no doubt also lectured to my Johannes Kepler. Part of the educational program was to learn to dispute in order to become eloquent defenders of the Lutheran Church. On one occasion, in 1593, Kepler proposed to defend a dissertation on how the phenomena in the night sky would appear to an observer on the moon. Probably to make the point, to the anti-Copernicans, that the way things appear at first sight depends on the location of the observer, read Earth. But when you watch from another location, such as the moon, you may draw totally different conclusions. The university authorities considered it too controversial, read Copernican, I guess, and vetoed it. The thought did not leave him. Later, Kepler would take a similar approach by looking at Earth from Mars, in a very clever way, without going there, of course. And he started working on a story around his moon perspective that would be published after his death by his son Ludwig as Somnium. One could defend that it qualifies as the world's first science fiction novel. About half a year before he would have finished his theology study, something happened that would have a lasting impact on the course of his life, and, I dare say, on the course of science. There were regions elsewhere, for example in Steiermark, Styria, in Austria, where they adopted the Württemberg model, including their education system. At the Stift Schule of Graz, in the southeast of today's Austria, 500 kilometers away, the mathematics professor died, and the board asked Tübingen for a suitable replacement. And they proposed Johannes Kepler. We can only speculate why, but a plausible explanation is that Kepler, although he said that he kept his doubts about some Lutheran doctrines and his enthusiasm for the Copernicus model to himself, might not have been completely successful in that, generating doubt whether he indeed would be the obedient and loyal Lutheran that he should be. It looks to me as a polite form of excommunication, because he would never ever have a job in Württemberg, and he tried. But he didn't know all that. He was shocked that a religious role was not going to happen. And eventually he accepted under the condition that he could still work to qualify for a job at the parish in Württemberg. The dukes released him of his duty to pay back part of his scholarship because he was moving out. And March 1594, at the age of barely 22, he left his Heimat Württemberg for the long travel to Graz. And there the spark was going to be ignited that indeed would make something exceptional come from his excellent and wonderful intelligence. Stay tuned.